You're listening to the official Reformed Stoic podcast, covering politics, philosophy, theology, conspiracy theories. I'm ready to get to the bottom of this life. Are you? Join Wolfgang, Sketty Squad, Purity Gang, as we strive to take dominion over this dying planet. I am Reformed Stoic, and this is my podcast. Hello, my precious people. How are we doing today? I'm Mr. Bearman. Let's go. Decided to start out this morning with a rock star, and now I'm drinking coffee for the show. See how we mix it up? Beard's getting absolutely massive. I'm going to have to trim this puppy up a little bit. Mainly for eating and drinking purposes. A bunch of stuff's getting in my mustache. Alrighty, guys. Gang's rolling in. I think I got actually a pretty interesting lineup for you today. Let's go ahead and get ready to get started. So, yesterday was the first grill cast. Pretty low key. Ultimately, guys, this podcast is educational. And I think a lot of people out there, I'm trying to show you that learning can be fun. So I kind of like the idea of 3 days a week for the podcast. Give me a little bit of a pressure valve, a little pressure release on Tuesday and Thursday. All we talked about yesterday was like Dragon Ball Z, anime, lifting weights. You know, I do have kind of a nerdy side to me that like goes dormant from time to time. Life has been really chill over here lately, man. I'm kind of feeling pretty good lately, to be honest. Just eating good food, marathoning Dragon Ball Z, got it on DVD. Trying to keep up on the drums, reading, working out, doing a decent job. But yeah, I figure Tuesdays, Thursdays, same times as the podcast. We're just going to kind of hang out and shoot the shit. No subject. And I put the VOD on Patreon. So I'm going to have those VODs unlisted, but sign up for Patreon and you can get the Grillcast VODs. Wow, that's a great deal. Okay. Anyway, my show for you today, we're going to go deep on the Frankfurt School. Very popular topic in certain circles on the internet. It was interesting how I learned like all the internet stuff against the Frankfurt School before I was to go to UNLV and learn more about the Frankfurt School in my philosophy of law class, where it's one of the most clear examples I've seen of academia taking the side of something and boasting it up like they're heroes. And then, you know, the woke far-right people of the internet saying these people are like the enemies of, I don't know, conservative Christian men, I guess. So I think it's an interesting topic to look into. I think today there's going to be like a focus on that. We'll see how long it goes. We got a pretty sizable video to watch on that subject. It's 25 minutes. So depending on how long that segment takes, then we're going to talk about USA and China, just some of the latest. Everybody's saying like, oh, Pelosi flew into Taiwan. There's like a bunch of equipment shifting around, and it'll be interesting to touch up on that. And then last but not least, I got a video, 15-minute video to watch on liberal versus conservative Christian theology. Sipping my coffee, just had my honey and peanut butter toast. What do you say we get started? A sketty. You're listening to the Reformed Stoic News segment. Let's go! Let's make it happen, gang. All right. Let's get everybody situated here. Get cozy for movie time. Start with this 6.5 minute clip.
Speaking of projects to try to transform human nature and restructure society, the Frankfurt School is often mentioned in that connection. And people see that as the root of much of the cultural subversion that we see around us in the West at the moment. And you point out rightly, I think, that the Frankfurt School flourished more in the United States than it had in interwar Germany. And that many of its core ideas about combating prejudice and the authoritarian personality became so profoundly Americanized that they informed American concepts of democracy. I think that is a perspective that people don't often hear, the idea that the Frankfurt School is in some sense homegrown in the US. How did that happen and why?
Well, I argue this in several of my books. You know, it's interesting you raised this point because my editor, acquisition editor, asked me to write this book for Cornell in NIU Press. They've merged now. She found that idea absolutely unsettling and not entirely convincing. She says, isn't this a German thing? And I said, well, and then after 1933, it became an American thing. These people moved here, and they were based in New York. Columbia University set up a special thing for the Institute for Social Research for Sozialforschung, and next to Columbia University. It came out sort of integrated into the university, and many of these people end up practicing psychiatry or psychology in New York. I mean, Erich Fromm is one of the most radical members of the Frankfurt School, who enjoys enormous success in the United States. Karen Harney, there are other members of this group, and I remember reacting strongly to a statement in Alan Bloom's book on the closing of the American mind. He speaks about how the Germans. Foreign ideas were brought over here and corrupted us. Well, in the case of the Frankfurt School, most of the corruption set in here. And then after the war, we moved them back in 1950 to Frankfurt. And, they had tremendous influence on re-educating Germans, and turning them into the basket cases they've become. One of the reasons it's well established in the United States is because the idea of democratic social engineering takes root in the United States in the early 20th century, right? It goes back to the progressive era. You have people like Seymour Martin Lipset, this Cold War liberal sociologist, who absolutely loves the authoritarian personality, which is published in the United States in English, in 1950. So he thinks that this is a great work. It's just that Adorno and Horkheimer were not sufficiently aware that communists could also have authoritarian personalities. They were just talking about fascism. So the Americans can make their peace with this. The only thing they didn't like about the Frankfurt School was that some of its members were very sympathetic to communism, and they got dragged before the House Un-American Activities Committee and so forth. But at the same time, they did enjoy great vogue.
Hold on, I want to do this real quick. Laughs in sympathetic to communism. Laughs in sympathetic to communism. All right. Continuing, sorry.
Among, within the American Academy, and they leave their mark on what becomes the fascist scale that is used in the United States in testing people for civil service and education. There's a fascism scale that is introduced in the 1950s. Then it gets updated in the 1970s, and basically they're testing people to make sure they don't have dangerous right-wing personalities. Now, this was being done throughout the anti-communist period of the Cold War, which people sometimes are not aware of. And at least liberal anti-communists were not,
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing to point out, that I feel maybe the far right, the alt-right type people who, they coined the Frankfurt School as like just about the boss of the game. These people talk about the Frankfurt School like this is really high up, top dog information. It's very relevant. We're just about to the end of this video. I was going to withhold some of my introductory comments to the Frankfurt School until after. But that detail that this is during, like, the birth of the CIA in this anti-communist setting. So on one hand, we have this communist sympathizing school of thought taking not complete control, but getting a high stake in American education alongside the time when our government has this extremely anti-communist sentiment, which the CIA was born into. You have this like these radical opposite things kind of happening at the same time. Just a preview of this article. I want to hurry up and get through these videos because I'm pretty excited about this article. It's called "The CIA and the Frankfurt School's Anti-Communism." So somebody in chat pointed out that these people are all Jewish. A lot of people try to make that point. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this. There are people out there that try to trace everything back to the Jews. Around here, there's a couple of places you could trace everything back to. Maybe some people would say the mercantile class or the Anglo establishment. But I'll tell you what, like, it's a pretty working model to kind of just like tie everything back to the CIA and kind of see how that works out. So let's go ahead and finish up this video here.
We're not opposed to this because they saw the communists as, as red fascists, essentially, as I argue. So the Frankfurt School became, quickly very, I'm thinking in German, sie wurden das eingebürgert. They became like domesticated or Americanized. And of course, during the Second World War, they were very important because they were all working, to uncover fascist personalities so that we could fight the fascists in Europe. The idea that somehow, that this is extraneous to the United States, I think is, for me, a very unconvincing argument.
What would you say is the clearest flowering of that tradition today, beyond obviously the use of fascism as a term designed to stamp out debate on particular topics?
Well, I think what happens in the second generation of the Frankfurt School, which is more radical, the one that goes back in Germany, people like Habermas are typical of that second generation. They're much more radical in some ways. They not only, buy into the anti-capitalist socialist argument, and they're not only interested in reconstructing the family. In Germany, they're very anti-nationalist. They're fanatically anti-German. They're the people who are now in power. You see the influence of the second generation of the Frankfurt School. The second generation is also open to LGBT. The first generation, I argue in my book, is really not. I mean, they favor tolerance for gays, and they think women should be in professions and so forth. They're not really that radical. I mean, as I say, they're somewhere to the right of what in America is the conservative movement right now, but they're not that, believe me. Herbert Marcuse was my professor and he looked upon feminism, he looked askance at feminism, even if he defended the Soviet Union and didn't think Stalin was a bad fellow, but he was very upset and I'm sure he would have been absolutely unsettled by the presence of gays. But I think it's the second generation that is much more radical. I also don't think they're quite as they're not as anti-capitalist or socialist, but they're into social engineering, and into gay rights and so forth. This is much more characteristic, of the people who come to the United States. And then the Frankfurt School that is reestablished in Germany, particularly under Adorno, not so much Horkheimer in the 1950s.
Okay, so here's kind of my one-liner mic drop on this to show that I know a little something about this subject. Whenever somebody who's, anything right of Marx, which is, just kind of a cliche thing to say. Whenever somebody who's anything right of Marx wants to speak on this subject, there's a lot of leftist fact checkers ready to say, actually, that's bogus rhetoric. What I have to say about the Frankfurt School isn't based in rhetoric. This is just fact. This is just the reality. The Frankfurt School is what the left became. You got a lot of people pointing out that it didn't always mean what it means today to be a Democrat. People talk about the silent majority, like all of these people who are silently conservative, who are just going to silently vote for people like Trump and try not to expose their power level in public. I think there's another silent population that's lesser talked about. It's the more classical liberal, old school Democrats, more just like white guy in a suit who lowers taxes and tries to help out the middle class. It's funny, many people share the sentiment that the left used to be smaller government and Republicans used to be bigger government. So the point is that the philosophy of the Frankfurt School, you got critical race theory, critical feminist theory. I believe they even get into things on the environment. Gay, lesbian, all of that. Everything that they teach became what the left is today. The modern far left, which is being catered to by the majority of mainstream Democrats at this point. It's the fad. It's what's in. It's what leftism has become. The work of the Frankfurt School is what the left today teaches. And I believe there's a lot of Democrats who probably jumped ship at some point. A lot of people getting quote-unquote red-pilled today because, not everybody who identified as a Democrat would be about this kind of critical theory of the Frankfurt School. So we have no comments here. Let's all get cozy for a nice 26-minute video. Bezmenov, Yuri, yeah, that's the guy who talks about the KGB subversion of the United States. I've seen that like a long time ago, and I thought it was amazing. But it's one of those things where like there is great truth in that. Like what he says is happening, the social engineering, the sexual engineering. I think he was spot on with all of that. He says it's being done by KGB agents. It's like a Russian communist subversion of the country. I don't know if I agree with that. I think a lot of what he was pointing out was just kind of like MK Ultra type stuff that maybe is more just like the CIA, but it's informative any way you slice it. Here we go.
The Frankfurt School has something of a reputation.
I mean, there's probably a lot of people who have their hands in the subversion of the United States, but videos like that, they're always trying to give you like a big smoking gun as to who's to blame. I think there's a lot of people out there who give you big pieces of the truth, but they skimp on some little details. It's hard to get a complete worldview, like what Wolfgang got for you. All right, let's shut up and watch the video.
Many of the scholars who worked for what was, and still is, officially called the Institute for Social Research, such as Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse, have had a huge influence on the study of society and culture, and secured their places on undergraduate reading lists across numerous subjects. It's necessary to note at the top of this video, however, that some of the Frankfurt School's notoriety outside of academia, in the contemporary moment at least, is due to the vitriol that has been levelled at them by their detractors. Figures on the political right, from Ben Shapiro to Jordan Peterson to the Times journalist Melanie Phillips, regularly invoke the Frankfurt School as a kind of intellectual group of supervillains, hell-bent on undermining Western culture. In today's video, my goal is to shed a bit of light on what the Frankfurt School was and is. I'm not going to be directly tackling any of the conspiracy theory stuff, yet it's worthwhile saying that, unlike when one usually unpicks a fanciful tale, which usually concludes with finding a somewhat boring reality underneath, the real story of the Frankfurt School is quite remarkable. It begins with a failed revolution, moves through a global conflict, involves exile, collaboration with the CIA, and meetings with—
Whoa there, buddy! Hold on, Mr. Bishop. Hold on, Mr. Tom Nichols guy. Hold on, Wolfgang. Wait a second. Did anybody just hear what he just said? I had to just stop there for a minute. Little buddy. Let's rewind there, little buddy.
Global conflict involves exile, collaboration with the CIA.
Okay. Collaboration with the CIA.
Move through a global conflict involves exile, collaboration with the CIA, and meetings with the Pope. And it is very much the story of the
Meetings with the Pope in collaboration with the CIA. So, I mean, once upon a time, Wolfgang was Wasp Gang, and everything kind of came down to Jesuits and the Vatican. Now it kind of more comes down to the CIA. If you read David Wemhoff's book, you'll realize that the CIA pretty much controls the Vatican and the Jesuits. I drank a lot of coffee, and I just want to tell you guys that I think I'm pretty smart. All right, let's go.
Frankfurt School, which I'll be focusing on today. Well, we'll touch on a number of different aspects of the school's work and get a sense of how their interests changed over time. My hope is that this overview might serve as an introduction to some more in-depth videos on individual scholars and texts. Of course, if that's something you would like to see me cover, then do let me know down in the comments below. And if you'd like to see those future videos, then subscribing and hitting that notification bell will mean you'll get a little buzz when they're released. Finally, if you like what...
Frankly, because I'm just not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And, yeah, I actually think I'm pretty damn close to, like, if I moved to a new town, I would consider just going to Mass. Like, I think theologically, I'm just kind of becoming a traditional Catholic, as maybe confusing as that is to some people. I've tried to keep people informed on the process, but we'll talk about that later. Maybe that would be a good topic to hash out tomorrow.
What I do here and would like to support me to make more videos like this, then I would be super grateful if you would check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. With that out of the way, however, let's crack on with the Frankfurt School. What the theory? Before we come on to discussing the Frankfurt School itself, it's worth grounding ourselves in a little bit of historical context. Our scene then is Germany. And by October 1918, it was evident that, for Germany, the First World War was going to end in defeat. Having already suffered through 4 hard years of conflict, the German people now not only had to contend with the demoralizing feeling of having lost the war, but also with the likelihood of financial hardship in order to pay reparations to the countries they had been defeated by. These economic concerns, along with a broader social tension between the nobility, who had led the war effort, and the working class, who had done the actual fighting, meant that things were tense. Now, if you were a Marxist intellectual at the time, and one thing the Frankfurt School's detractors do...
Bro, I was raised... I got out of it pretty quick, but... the first churches I ever went to growing up was Catholic Mass. I did communion. I went to Sunday school. Eventually, I stopped. I just became like a Comedy Central watching atheists and got into like pop punk and pop culture. And I know it so well how people just naturally get sucked into the paradigms of the time, a combination of what you learn at school and what you see on TV and in movies and in music. Became an atheist. Went on a perennial quest through a lot of weird occultism, leading me to Southern Israelites' version of Christianity. And I've just kind of gone full circle back to where it's like, wow, I could see myself going to Catholic Mass again. And it's pretty fascinating, man. It seems like a pretty logical ending point for me. The Mother Church, bros. What? There's a lot to talk about with that, though, so let's not get distracted.
Do get right is that they were, initially at least, Marxists. You would have been on the edge of your seat. For most Marxists at the time signed up to what's sometimes called the stage theory of history, which argued that human society had developed and would develop through a series of stages. Feudalism had given way to something called mercantilism, which had given way to capitalism, which would, in turn, give way to communism. It was considered inevitable that capitalism would sow the seeds of its own destruction, and that, as soon as its exploitative nature became clear to the working class, they would rise up to overthrow it. And many felt that the conditions in Germany in 1918 were ripe for such a revolution. Indeed, in Russia, the year prior, exactly that had happened. The February and October revolutions had led to the overthrowing of the Tsar and the establishment of Soviet rule in its place. There was thus a sense among left-wing academics that all they had to do was sit back and wait for Germany, the birthplace of Karl Marx himself, to do the same. And Germany did experience a revolution. Days before the end of the First World War, a sailors' revolt led to uprisings in cities across the country. Ultimately, however, the communist faction of the revolution, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were outmaneuvered by the less radical Social Democratic Party. While the revolution did lead to the abdication of the Kaiser and the introduction of a new constitution then, after the dust had settled, Germany remained a fundamentally capitalist nation. It was with this supposed failure of the German people to throw off the yoke of capitalism in mind that, in May 1923, Felix Weil, the son of a wealthy grain merchant with a keen interest in Marxism, organised the Erste Marxistische Arbeitswoche, or First Marxist Work Week. One of the key goals of the week was to consider why it was that Germany's revolution had not yielded greater economic reform. Certainly, the perfidiousness of the Social Democratic Party had played a role, but on being cheated in this way, why didn't the people, who had risen up in great number in support of a socialist revolution, rise up again? The initial plan was for this to be the first in a number of similar conferences for left-wing German intellectuals. Those gathered, however, felt that something more permanent was needed. Felix Weil thus turned to his wealthy father, Hermann, and convinced him to provide an endowment to establish and maintain a permanent institute for Marxist-informed study. On the 22nd of June 1924, then, the Institute for Social Research opened its doors in Frankfurt am Main. Located at 17 Victoria Alley, Weil appointed as the institute's first director Karl Grünberg, an economic and social historian. In his opening address at the Institute, Grünberg described himself as a proponent of scientific socialism, stressing that, "When I speak here of Marxism, I do not understand it in terms of party politics, but rather in a purely scientific sense. That is, as an integral system of economics, of a scientific worldview, and a clearly circumscribed method of research." What is clear from this is that Grünberg did not see the role of the Institute as being to write a new version of the Communist Manifesto, but to instead engage in a more detached form of study, informed by the theoretical, economic approach of Marx's Capital. Although initially seeing the failure of the German Revolution as a wake-up call to reconsider their analysis of society, however, the work produced by the Institute during this period was pretty similar to that which had gone on before. Studies published by scholars working at the Institute for Social Research during its first few years boasted such tantalizing titles as Economy and Society in China, The Law of Accumulation and Collapse in the Capitalist System, and Experiments in Economic Planning in the Soviet Union, 1917 to 1927. Throughout, the stage theory of history remained very much intact. Rather than questioning the notion that a socialist revolution was inevitable, the Institute seemed merely to have come to the conclusion that the time hadn't quite been right. All of this was to change in 1930, however, when Grünberg fell ill and resigned his post as director. The position was soon filled by Max Horkheimer, who was not an economist nor a historian, but instead had trained in psychology and philosophy. This evidently gave Horkheimer a somewhat different perspective on society, and his tenure as director saw the introduction of a new set of theoretical influences to the Institute. In particular, it led to a shift away from economics and an embrace of the social sciences instead. Or, in other words, it led to a shift away from the study of the economy and towards the study of people, society, and culture. See, Horkheimer was highly skeptical of the notion that capitalism would inevitably lead to a socialist revolution. He saw the kind of empirical study which Grünberg had encouraged at the Institute to be somewhat naive. Such an approach, he argued, assumed that people engage with the economy and society more broadly entirely logically. It assumed that as soon as people recognised that they were being exploited, they would instantly cast off the system that was exploiting them. Horkheimer, however, recognised that the reality was somewhat more complex. 3 years earlier, for instance, he'd written an essay titled The Impotence of the German Working Class, which argued that capitalism, rather than inspiring insurrection, had fairly successfully integrated the working class into its structure. In particular, he noted that a wedge had successfully been driven between those who were in long-term employment and those who were more sporadically or entirely unemployed, which led to the former group often voting and acting to sustain capitalism and thus protect their jobs rather than risk them in the turmoil of either violent or democratic revolution. Horkheimer's approach, and that of the other scholars who he brought to work at the Institute, such as Theodor Adorno, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse, was thus far more holistic. It encompassed the study of social and cultural forces as well as simply economic ones. And rather than theorizing the manner in which the working class would overthrow capitalism, it primarily sought to shed light on the various ways in which they were discouraged from doing so. In a 1936 paper, Horkheimer would christen this mode of societal analysis critical theory. The goal of critical theory was, and is, to draw upon diverse fields from economics to sociology to political science to psychology and geography, say, to foreground the ways in which capitalism encourages conformity. As Stephen Eric Bronner has written then, the Frankfurt School were concerned less with what Marx called the economic base than the political and cultural superstructure of society. They recognized that understanding how capitalism works required more than just an understanding of its economic aspects, but also how it shapes social and cultural forces too, and in turn, how society and culture shape us. It is perhaps already evident that Horkheimer and Co.'s view of the world was somewhat bleak. The optimism of the early Institute for Social Research had been replaced with a view of the world, or at least Germany, that saw the overthrow of capitalism as becoming increasingly unlikely. Yet, in 1933, matters became even worse when Adolf Hitler was made Chancellor of Germany. As left-wing intellectuals, those working at and associated with the Frankfurt School would have already been under threat. On top of this, however, the majority of its number were also Jewish. With the swastika flag raised over Frankfurt Town Hall then, Horkheimer made the decision to close the Institute premises on Victoria Alley and to lead the Frankfurt School into exile. It would be 16 years before the Frankfurt School would return to Germany. Yet, in spite of the circumstances, the years in exile were highly productive. The Institute first moved to Geneva, before, in 1935, Erich Fromm, on a visit to the United States, persuaded Columbia University in New York to provide the group with a new home. The Frankfurt School set up base at 428 West 117th Street in Morningside Heights, but in truth, they spent little time in New York. In 1940, Horkheimer moved to California, with Theodor Adorno following not far behind. Herbert Marcuse instead moved to Washington, where he worked for the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA. Both the rise of fascism in...
Okay, wait a second. I was starting to get a little lost there. Who worked for the OSS, precursor to the CIA?
Herbert Marcuse instead moved to Washington, where he worked for the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA. Both the rise of fascism in Europe and the slide of the USSR into authoritarianism would have a huge impact on the work of the Frankfurt School. Far from simply studying why people might fail to embrace socialism, an ideology which many of the Frankfurt School thinkers had an increasingly testing relationship with, the school's work now also had to take into
Nietzsche
account why
donated
people
$1 to
had
Wolfgang.
come to
It's
embrace
only
various
coincidence they
forms of
all were Jews.
totalitarianism.
Is this the night
This is
our
the
boy
central
finally see
concern
who
of
are
one
the
of the
big
Frankfurt
destroyers?
School's key texts.
Or the Jewish
Thank you
illusion,
for the
Christianity
donation. I
keep
will
him
be
in
checking
delusion?
donations at the end of the show today. Or maybe if I get a moment, we'll take a look at it real quick.
A book written collaboratively by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno called Dialectic of Enlightenment. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno locate the origin of the rise of totalitarianism in the Enlightenment. And this, at first, might seem strange. The Enlightenment, an intellectual movement which took place mostly during the 18th century, argued for the supremacy of human reason above all else. And what could be less reasonable than fascism? Well, Horkheimer and Adorno did not see totalitarianism as irrational. Instead, they saw it as reason and rationality taken to its ultimate extreme. See, Enlightenment thinking sought to understand the world empirically. It sought to do away with mysticism and mere belief in favour of quantification and the discovery of universal laws which explained how the world works. And this is all well and good when applied to physics and chemistry, yet when we apply this same way of thinking to people, it has a somewhat darker potential. Horkheimer and Adorno saw totalitarianism as the application of an extreme conception of objectivism, uniformity, and standardization to the whole of society, with the consequence of the reduction of individuals to mere numbers, solely parts of a machine. Horkheimer and Adorno did not only see these traits as being present in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, however. They argued that the same kind of thinking had also come to permeate the capitalist nations. Perhaps inspired by their surroundings in Los Angeles, they wrote acerbically of what they called the culture industry. They wrote that culture today is infecting everything with sameness. Film, radio, and magazines form a system. Each branch of culture is unanimous with itself, and all are unanimous together. Horkheimer and Adorno argued that the sole goal of the culture industry was to make money, and thus that it had come to rely on creating films, music, books, and whatever else which pleased as many people as possible, as much of the time as possible. And through creating a culture permeated by sameness, they argued that what they referred to as mass culture robbed people of their imagination and their potential for individuality. Dialectic of Enlightenment is a somewhat dense philosophical text. Earlier, however, I stated the Frankfurt School's desire to combine methods from multiple academic disciplines in their studies. Later then, Adorno, along with a number of other scholars at the University of California, Berkeley, set about studying authoritarianism from a more clearly sociological and psychological standpoint. The results of their studies were published in a 1950 book called The Authoritarian Personality, which most famously derived an F scale, which sought to identify how liable an individual might be to supporting a fascist political program. Through asking a set of questions to an individual, it claimed to be able to place them on a spectrum from democratic personality to authoritarian personality. Though its findings would later come to be challenged, the authoritarian personality came to be highly influential. It is interesting to note here, however, the use of the term democratic in Adorno et al.'s spectrum. For the research carried out at Berkeley was heavily informed by similar research that the Frankfurt School had undertaken before leaving Germany. In those earlier studies, the spectrum had referred to an authoritarian personality and a revolutionary personality.
All right, let's go ahead and start tackling this article, and then we'll come back and finish the video, trying to mix it up a little bit. The CIA and the Frankfurt School's Anti-Communism, Foundations of the Global Theory Industry. So this is from the Philosophical Salon. Frankfurt School critical theory has been, along with French theory, one of the hottest commodities of the global theory industry. Together, they serve as the common source for so many of the trend-setting forms of theoretical critique that currently dominate the academic market in the capitalist world. From post-colonial and decolonial theory to queer theory, Afro-pessimism, and beyond. The Frankfurt School's political orientation has therefore had a foundational effect on the globalized Western intelligentsia. The luminaries of the first generation of the Institute for Social Research, particularly Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, who will be the focus of this essay, are towering figures in what is referred to as Western or cultural Marxism. For those familiar with Jürgen Habermas's reorientation away from historical materialism in the second and then third generations of the Frankfurt School, this early work often represents a veritable golden age of critical theory, when it was still, though perhaps passive or pessimistic, dedicated in some capacity to radical politics. If there is a grain of truth in this assumption, it is only insofar as the early Frankfurt School is compared to later generations that, refashioned critical theory as radical liberal or even just blatantly liberal ideology. However, this point of comparison is setting the bar much too low, as is the case whenever one reduces politics to academic politics. After all, the first generation of the Frankfurt School lived through some of the most cataclysmic clashes and global class struggle of the 20th century, when a veritable intellectual world war was being fought over the meaning and significance of communism. In order to avoid being the dupes of history or of the parochialism of the Western Academy, it is therefore important to recontextualize the Institute for Social Research's work in relationship to international class struggle. One of the most significant features of this context was the desperate attempt on the part of the capitalist ruling class, its state managers and ideologues, to redefine the left, in the words of Cold Warrior CIA agent Thomas Braden, as the compatible, meaning non-communist left. As Braden and others involved have explained in detail, one important facet of this struggle consisted in the use of foundation money and agency front groups like the Congress for Cultural Freedom to promote anti-communism and lure leftists into taking positions against actually existing socialism. Horkheimer participated in at least one junket organized by the CCF in Hamburg. Adorno published in the CIA-funded journal Der Monat, the largest review of its kind in Europe and the model for many of the agency's other publications. His articles appeared as well in two other CIA magazines, Encounter and Tempo Presente. He also hosted in his home, corresponded, and collaborated with the CIA operative who was arguably the leading figure in the German anti-communist Kulturkampf, Melvin Lasky, founder and chief editor of Der Monat, as well as a member of the original steering committee for the CIA's CCF. Lasky told Adorno that he was open to every form of collaboration with the Institute for Social Research, including publishing their articles and any other declaration as quickly as possible in his pages. Adorno took him up on the offer and sent him for unpublished manuscripts. Including Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason in 1949. Horkheimer's lifelong collaborator was thus closely connected to the CCF networks in West Germany, and his name appears on a document likely from 1958 to 1959 that outlined plans for an all-German committee of the CCF. What is more, even after it was revealed in 1966 that this international propaganda organized was a CIA front, Adorno continued to be included in the expansion plans of the Paris headquarters, as it was business as usual in the part of Germany overseen by the U.S. This is only the tip of the iceberg, as we shall see, and it is nowise surprising since Adorno and Horkheimer rose to global prominence within the elite networks of the anti-communist left. All right, let's get through this next section and then we'll go back to the video. A dialectical analysis of theoretical production. The analysis that follows is based on a dialectical account of the social totality that situates the subjective theoretical practices of these two founding fathers of critical theory within the objective world of international class struggle. It does not accept the arbitrary dividing line that many petty bourgeoisie academics desperately try to erect between intellectual production and the broader socioeconomic world, as if someone's thought could and should be separated from their life, as well as from the material system of theoretical production, circulation, and reception that I will here refer to as the intellectual apparatus. Such a non-dialectical assumption, after all, is little more than a symptom of an idealist approach to theoretical work, which presumes that there is a spiritual and conceptual realm that functions completely independently of material reality and the political economy of knowledge. This presupposition perpetuates intellectual commodity fetishism, meaning the idealization the idolization of the sacred products of the theory industry that prohibits us from situating them within the overall social relations of production and class struggle. It also serves the interests of those who have or aspire to part of a particular franchise within the global theory industry, if it be Frankfurt School critical theory or any other, because it protects the brand image of the franchise itself, which remains unsullied by the actual social relations of production. Whereas intellectual commodity fetishism is a principal feature of consumption within the theory industry, brand image management is the hallmark of production. For such a dialectical analysis, it is important to acknowledge that Adorno and Horkheimer did indeed mobilize their subjective agency in formulating significant critiques of capitalism, consumer society, and the culture industry. Far from denying this, I would merely like to situate these criticisms within the objective social world, which entails asking a very simple and practical question that is rarely raised within academic circles. If capitalism is recognized as having negative effects, what is to be done about it? The deeper one mines down their life and work, sifting through the deliberate obscurantism of their discourse, the more obvious their response becomes, and the easier it is to understand the primary social function of their shared intellectual project. For as critical as they sometimes are of capitalism, they regularly affirm that there is no alternative, and nothing can or should ultimately be done about it. What is more, as we shall see, their criticisms of capitalism pale in comparison to their uncompromising condemnation of socialism. Their brand of critical theory ultimately leads to an acceptance of the capitalist order, since socialism is judged to be far worse. Not unlike most of the other fashionable discourses in the capitalist academy, they proffer a critical theory that we might call ABS theory, anything but socialism. So this is setting up something pretty interesting here. What I think is being said here is that they're talking about the CIA collaboration with the Frankfurt School, and the CIA had a very strong anti-socialist, anti-communist stance at the time. So they were trying to groom the left to develop a political philosophy that did not present communism or socialism as an answer and would take a stance against communism and socialism. That's in line with what is spoken around these parts, that the New World Order, the current system, the current elite, they are not communists, they are not socialists. This order of things that we are living in that is highly corrupt is in fact capitalist, and the CIA's objective, it sounds like more or less with the Frankfurt School, was to just make sure that the left didn't embrace communism as a solution, to give them some sort of a solution to the capitalist world that did not embrace communism. So that makes sense to me. Let's finish up these two paragraphs and then get back to the video. It is not the least bit surprising in this regard that Adorno and Horkheimer have been so widely supported and promoted within the capitalist world. In order to shore up the compatible non-communist left over and against the threat of actually existing socialism, what better tactic than to champion scholars like these as some of the most important and even most radical Marxist thinkers of the 20th century? Marxism can thereby be redefined as a kind of anti-communist critical theory that is not directly connected to class struggle from below, but rather freely criticizes all forms of domination, and which ultimately sides with capitalist control societies over and against the purported fascist horrors of powerful socialist states. This is a lot to chew on, guys. That's not going to make sense to a lot of people. What do you mean the Frankfurt School was against communism? That doesn't make any sense. The bad guy, the boss of the game, isn't communism. And it doesn't mean that communism isn't bad. It's just that the CIA, they were founded to eliminate communism at all costs. Communism was an enemy of our system, which is an alternate system that is capitalism. And you think about these last few sentences here, that it focuses not on class domination, but all forms of domination. So it starts to focus on white people versus minorities, straight people versus homosexuals, men versus women. Do you see how this CIA collaborating group took the left, and rather than focus on the economic disparities, which is ultimately the problem, because we've seen this economic leviathan, companies like BlackRock that control 70% of the United States' GDP, rather than focus on that ultimate unified domination, it says that they focused on, quote, freely criticizes all forms of domination, and which ultimately sides with capitalist control. Woo! All right, last paragraph here, and then we're going back to the video. Since benighted anti-communist has been so widely promoted within capitalist structure, benighted anti-communism, this attempted redefinition of Marxism might not be immediately recognizable to some readers as reactionary and social chauvinist, in the sense that it ultimately elevates bourgeoisie society over any alternative. Unfortunately, major swaths of the population in the capitalist world have been inculcated into the knee-jerk response of uninformed calumny rather than rigorous analysis when it comes to actually existing socialism. Since the material history of these projects, with all of their ups and downs, rather than mythological horror stories propagandistically constructed around a communist boogeyman, will be essential to understanding the argument that follows. I take the liberty of referring the reader to the deep and rich work of rigorous historians like Annie Lacroix, Riz, Domenico Losurdo, Carlos Martinez, Michael Parenti, Albert Szymanski, Jacques Paulez, and Walter Rodney, amongst others. I also encourage the reader to examine the important quantitative comparisons between capitalism and socialism undertaken by exacting analysts like Minky Lee, Vicente Navarro, and Tricontentional Institute for Social Research. Such work is anathema to the dominant ideology, and for good reasons. It scientifically examines the evidence rather than relying on horary tropes and uninformed ideological reflexes. It is the type of historical and materialist work, moreover, that has largely been overshadowed by the speculative forms of critical theory promoted by the global theory industry. This is deep stuff, guys. This is huge. This is huge. A lot of people, like I've already said, leading the left away from communism and socialism as a solution and turning them against pre-existing socialist and communist establishments in conformity with the CIA's anti-communist sentiment that was dominating everything at the time. A lot of food for thought there. All right, let's finish this guy up.
It was not as if much had been changed around the definition of the latter personality either. The term revolutionary had merely been swapped out for democratic. There are a number of ways of reading this change. Firstly, the Frankfurt School had never been afraid of altering their language for reasons of political expediency. They had often avoided using recognisably Marxist terminology in describing their work in order not to put off less radically minded readers, funders, or other stakeholders. Many on the left, however, increasingly began to wonder whether the Frankfurt School had lost its radical edge. A year before the publication of The Authoritarian Personality in 1950, with the Second World War having ended in the defeat and dissolution of Nazi Germany, Horkheimer made the decision to move the Frankfurt School back to its original home, now part of the newly established Federal Republic of Germany, or colloquially, West Germany. The Frankfurt School now found themselves at the forefront of German sociological thinking. The critical theory that Horkheimer had envisaged in 1936 and developed along with Adorno in Dialectic of Enlightenment was now an established body of work, which had begun to have a real influence on how scholars in multiple fields approached the study of human society, politics, and culture. The following years saw the publication of a number of further works by Frankfurt School scholars. In 1951, Theodor Adorno published Minima Moralia, Reflections from...
Theodor Adorno, that's one of the guys who is very frequently mentioned in this article, along with Horkheimer. These are CIA boys.
...a damaged life, which argued that human life was now irrevocably damaged, and that, however hard one tried, the inhumanity of contemporary society made living a good, honest life, as centuries of philosophers had sought to define it, was now impossible. In 1964, Herbert Marcuse published a book called One-Dimensional Man, Studies in the Ideology of Advanced Industrial Society, which came to some not dissimilar conclusions. A critique of both capitalist society and that of the Soviet Union, the book argued that, under both systems, critical thinking was becoming a dying art. In the capitalist nations, Marcuse argued, people have become so assimilated into the capitalist mode of production and the bureaucracy needed to maintain it that they failed to be able to think in anything but a one-dimensional manner, uncritical of the system around them. The pessimism which had begun with Horkheimer's declaration of the impotence of the German working class and been exacerbated by the Frankfurt School's wartime experience had thus seemingly come to permeate its work. The only voice resistant to this pessimism within the Frankfurt School was that of Jürgen Habermas, who had joined the school to study under Horkheimer and Adorno in 1956, but who increasingly was at odds with his mentors. Though he would later return to become the director of the Institute for Social Research, he in fact transferred his PhD away from it to the University of Marburg in order to escape what he saw as the Frankfurt School's unbearable defeatism. The divisions within the Frankfurt School over whether any hope remained for socialist revolution would come to a head in May 1968, when, as I've discussed in my video on Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, civil unrest broke out in France. Students and workers took to the street in a defiantly anti-capitalist uprising. It's worth stressing that these protests had a huge impact. France's economy was brought to a complete standstill. The president, Charles de Gaulle, was evacuated to Germany, and the government genuinely feared the outbreak of full-scale revolution. Though less pronounced than in France, students in other nations also went out onto the streets in support of various causes. What united all of them was an opposition to the authoritarian form of capitalism which had come to dominate the advanced capitalist nations. Indeed, their critique of contemporary society shared much with that of Horkheimer and Adorno in Dialectic of Enlightenment. Nevertheless, it was Herbert Marcuse who had the clearest influence on the striking students of May 1968. His essay Repressive Tolerance, published in 1965, had ably foregrounded the manner in which capitalist society could feature totalitarian aspects, and this spoke fairly directly to the protesters' grievances. More than this, however, where Horkheimer and Adorno remained skeptical of the likelihood that any meaningful change would come out of the so-called Eventement, Marcuse was quite glad that some of his more pessimistic pronouncements in One-Dimensional Man seemed to have been proven wrong, and that critical thinking and action were alive and well. Horkheimer and Adorno's refusal to find any hope in the strikes and protests did not go unnoticed either. Activists began to disrupt Adorno's lectures, with the one-time Marxist shift in ideological position perhaps being exemplified by his decision to call the police. This only made matters worse, and later, a group of students invaded his lecture theatre once again, writing on the blackboard, "If Adorno is left in peace, capitalism will never cease." Adorno was eventually forced to cancel the rest of his lectures, which were to be some of his last before his death in 1969. Horkheimer too died just a few years later in 1973, with Marcuse.
So Adorno and Horkheimer, those are both of the CIA boys from this article. And it's interesting that they said the students invaded the Adorno presentation, and they said, if he's in peace, capitalism will never cease. And what this article was saying is that the CIA wanted to create a non-communist solution to capitalism. They wanted to create some sort of an anti-capitalist sentiment that ultimately doesn't result in socialism or communism. Basically a non-solution, like a fake solution to capitalism that absorbs people into it. And it sounds like maybe some true blue socialists and communists weren't buying it.
Marcuse passing away in 1978. In 1983, Jürgen Habermas became director of the Institute for Social Research, and his own work has been almost as influential of that as his forebears. Given his early work in which he introduced the concept of the public sphere to the world, it is no surprise that he has been a truly public intellectual. Perhaps most notable, given the fact that many of the Frankfurt School conspiracy theories revolve around some form of plot to undermine Western values. In 2004, Habermas took part in a debate with Pope Benedict XVI at the Catholic Academy of Bavaria, in which he argued for the positive role that religion can play in holding society together. Though I would very much like to discuss the work of Habermas in a future video, however, it is very much the period between Horkheimer's installation as director of the Institute of Social Research and his and Adorno's death that most people are referring to when they speak of the Frankfurt School. As such, I'll take the opportunity to draw this video to a bit of a close. The impact that the Frankfurt School had upon how we critically analyse the world around us is undeniable. With regard to left-wing thought in the broadly Marxist tradition, they were a key factor in discouraging a purely economic analysis, which saw capitalism's collapse as inevitable, and the development of a more holistic study of capitalism, cognizant of the influence of social and cultural forces in its maintenance. Though the school may have had radical origins, however, in truth, this revolutionary zeal faded over time. Towards the ends of their lives, many of its most prominent members were more likely to be chided for their deeply ingrained pessimism than they were to be held up as examples of dangerous insurgents. Indeed, far from presenting us with a unified doctrine of thought, the work of the Frankfurt School is highly diverse, both in the aspects of society that it focuses on and the methods that it uses in its analysis. It is partly this diversity and embrace of ideas from an array of different academic subjects that has allowed it to have such a wide-ranging influence across fields, including sociology, philosophy, political science, and many more. If we were to pick out one key theme from the work of the Frankfurt School, however, it would be the potential that contemporary society has to foster conformity and to erode individuality. The critical theory that Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and others developed asks us to be watchful for these tendencies and work to find ways of engaging with the world which enable individuality and empathy to flourish. Thank you very much for watching this video.
Okay, so I'm coming to an interesting conclusion here from what we've learned today. The people who are schooled in alt-right, the people who go to 4chan poll and adopt that kind of ideology, or you're a MAGA-pede, Ben Shapiro, mainstream conservacuck politics, you're going to say, now how in the hell would it make sense for the CIA to want to turn leftists against communism and socialism? Because people on the right, people on the mainstream far right, everything is communism too. There's communists in the schools. The educators are commies. Antifa are commies. The enemy is communism. So what I see here is the powers that be want the right to have this constant red flag of communism, just like the CIA. Communism, major threat of communism, our enemy is communism and that movement is communism. But then you look at the system that was chosen for the left, and they have been given a series of non-solutions to capitalism, where ultimately the CIA's goal was to take this revolutionary party and instead of focusing on the main dominance of the rich over the poor, they have focused on all forms of dominance, patriarchal, man versus woman, straight versus gay, black versus white. So this revolutionary party will manifest their revolutionary actions and spirit behind causes that are not a threat to capitalism, where the solution ultimately is not to get rid of capitalism. It's not socialism and communism. So you have the right in this never-ending chase of something that doesn't really exist, and you have the left doing this non-stop revolution that doesn't ultimately solve the problem. Ooh, boy. And the CIA is everywhere. So why would you want two parties both chasing their tails, never get anywhere? Two parties that have imaginary enemies that results in nothing. So theoretically, like, they're just designed to never solve the problem and never get to real solutions. And anyway, I feel like this is one of the best podcasts ever, dude. I feel like there should be more people here right now, but it's fine. People will watch this later. Yes, so the people who think that the left is insufferable and you hate everything about what the left has become and ultimately what it always was, they've been given fake. It doesn't amount to anything. We did it. We overthrew the patriarchy. We did it. We overthrew white men. We did it. We overthrew racism. It never amounts to anything. They get balloons and confetti and yay, we did it. You know, the public school system is ruined by a bunch of far left radical loony teachers, and nobody's taken the real capitalists out of power. Like, a real solution to capitalism is like, well, let's take a look at people who own like 70% of the country's GDP, like BlackRock, and let's just remove them from their wealth. And whoa. Nobody's coming to those kind of solutions, not on the right or on the left, because the right defends capitalism. Well, you're not a communist, are you? It's not about handouts, bucko. Go get a job. You'll be like BlackRock someday. And then the left, you know, you guys on the left, you're getting funded by Goldman Sachs and Rockefeller. And it's like, well, they know it's important. Rockefeller funds climate change. Rockefeller funds pro-homosexuality. It funds feminism. Rockefeller's on our side. Two wings of the same bird. Well, I wouldn't say it's a commie bird. This is big stuff, guys. This is groundbreaking stuff. I don't even know if we got time for these comments here. This video was amazing. Never really thought about the Enlightenment way of approach. You know, you have to know what to look for in this video. I feel like there's going to be a lot of economics is a social science. The fact that certain academics pretend it isn't has been corrosive to the discipline and society as a whole. The idea of a purely scientific socialism has been problematic for similar reasons. Ultimately, we're studying the fulfillment of human needs and desires, not just productive efficiencies for their own sake. It's something you gotta... The people who are like maybe at the gate of leaving behind the alt-right, you were born and bred, you've been raised on, those guys are commies, evil commies, get the commies, get the commies. And you're like, but the CIA is trying to... I mean, ultimately, if you're really in line with mainstream conservative, you'll say, well, the CIA are Americans. You sound like you're pro-communism and anti-America, because there's a very public anti-communist stance from the CIA. Now, does that mean that the solution is communism? Well, what does real communism amount to? It amounts to grabbing all of the elite from the very top, plucking all of them from the very top and saying, we are going to repossess the means of production, and we're going to take BlackRock and Rockefeller and Rothschild, and we're going to shove you all into gulags and take all your money. And I think I'm about to get a fucking knock on the door from the CIA for even, like, hinting about that. Like, whoa there, buddy! Taking away Rothschild's money. Do you have any idea how anti-American you sound right now? BlackRock not controlling 70% of the United States GDP. Hey, buddy, you ever sit down and have a discussion with your good old Central Intelligence Agency about what it means to be an American? It means that nobody's taking Rockefeller's money, buddy. Oh, I'm feeling myself today, boyos. Drank a lot of coffee. All right, this article was really the gem of today. It's laying out this idea that the CIA wanted to use the Frankfurt School to create fake solutions to the capitalist problem. Although their early lives were marked by the world historical events of the Russian Revolution and the attempted revolution in Germany, Adorno and Horkheimer were aesthetes wary of the supposed morass of mass politics. While their interest in Marxism was piqued by these incidents, it was primarily of an intellectual nature. Horkheimer did become marginally involved in activities around the Munich Council Republic after World War I, particularly by providing support for some of those involved after the council had been brutally suppressed. However,
Nietzsche donated $1 to Wolfgang. Lol, this man will never blame anything on the Jews because the Bible tells him they are chosen by God. Christianity is a genius Jewish illusion to serve the Jews. Wake up.
Thank you for the dono. We'll get to the donos after this article. Their class standing was far from insignificant in this regard, for it positions them and their political outlook within the larger objective world of the social relations of production. Both Frankfurt School theorists were from affluent families. Adorno's father was a wealthy wine merchant, and Horkheimer's was a millionaire who owned several textile factories, mercantile class people. Adorno had no personal ties at all to socialist political life and maintained throughout his life a deep aversion to formal membership of any party organization. Similarly, Horkheimer was never an overt member of any working class party. The same is generally true of the other figures involved in the early years of the Frankfurt School. None of those belonging to the Horkheimer circle was politically active. None of them had its origins either in the labor movement or in Marxism. In the words of John Abromeat, Horkheimer sought to preserve the supposed independence of theory and rejected the position of Lenin, Lukács, and the Bolsheviks that critical theory must be rooted in the working class, or more specifically, working class parties. He encouraged critical theorists to operate as intellectual free agents rather than grounding their research in the proletariat, which was a type of work that he disparaged as totalitarian propaganda. Adorno's overall position, like Herbert Marcuse, was summarized by Marie-José Lavalle in the following terms. The Bolshevik Party, which Lenin made the vanguard of the October Revolution, was a centralizing and repressive institution which would shape the Soviet state in its image and turn the dictatorship of the proletariat into its own dictatorship. When Horkheimer took over the directorship of the Institute for Social Research in 1930, his stewardship was characterized by speculative concerns with culture and authority rather than rigorous historical materialist analysis of capitalism, class struggle, and imperialism. In the words of Gillian Rose, instead of politicizing academia, the Institute under Horkheimer academized politics. Interesting. This was perhaps seen nowhere more clearly in the constant policy of the Institute under Horkheimer's direction, which continued to be abstinence not only from every activity which was even remotely political, but also from any collective or organized effort to publicize the situation in Germany or to support emigres. With the rise of Nazism, Adorno attempted to go into hibernation, assuming that the regime would only target the orthodox pro-Soviet Bolshevists as communists who had drawn attention to themselves politically. They would indeed be the first to be put in the concentration camps. He refrained from public criticism of any kind of the Nazis and their great power policies. This is a big article, man. Let's see. Critical theory, American style. Fascism and communism are the same. Let's go ahead and kick it off here. One of the most consistent political claims advanced by Adorno and Horkheimer is that there is a totalitarian equivalence between fascism and communism. If it manifests itself in socialist state-building projects, anti-colonial movements of the Third World, or even new left mobilizations in the Western world. In all three cases, those who think they are breaking out of the shackling society are only making things worse. The patent fact that Western capitalist countries offered no significant bulwark against fascism, which arose within the capitalist world, and that it was precisely the Soviet Union that ultimately defeated it, does not seem to have caused them to reflect on the viability of this benighted and simplistic thesis, which is to say nothing of the importance of socialism to anti-colonial movements and the uprisings of the 1960s. In fact, for all of his moral opinion on the horrors of Auschwitz, Adorno appears to have forgotten who actually liberated the infamous concentration camp, the Red Army. Horkheimer had formulated his version of horseshoe theory with particular clarity in a limited circulation pamphlet published in 1942, which broke with the Aesopian language of many of the Institute's other publications. Directly accusing Frederick Engels of utopianism, he averred that the socialization of the means of production had led to an increase in repression and ultimately to an authoritarian state. The bourgeoisie earlier held government in check through its property, according to this multimillionaire's son, whereas in new society, socialism simply did not function, except to produce the mistaken belief that one was, through the party honored leader or the supposed march of history, acting in the name of something greater than oneself. Horkheimer's position in this piece is perfectly in line with anarcho-anti-communism, which is a very widespread ideology within the Western left. A classless democracy is supposed to emerge spontaneously from the people through free agreement, without the supposedly pernicious influence of parties or states. As Domenico Lacerdo has insightfully pointed out, the Nazi war machine was ravaging the USSR in the early 1940s, and Horkheimer's call for socialists to abandon the state and party centralization therefore amounted to nothing less than a demand that they capitulate before the Nazis' genocidal rampage. Whew, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, guys, because this article is it's just too massive. I'm going to post this article in my community tab. So anybody who wants to read the rest of it, you are free to do so. I think we got some very interesting insights on the Frankfurt School today, buddies. And we sure sucked up a lot of time in that section. So we're not going to dilly-dally, just kind of checking up on our buddies in China, on our buddy Nancy Pelosi. And let me just label this. Okay. Is available. The central thesis was that the CIA was controlling elements of the Frankfurt School, particularly Horkheimer and Adorno, who were creating an anti-communist sentiment within the left. The left had targeted capitalism as a problem, and they wanted to create solutions that ultimately didn't pose any threat to established capitalism. All right, let's go ahead and check on the donations real quick. I might want to consider because I know that you guys can hear the donos play, and it kind of just plays over whatever we're watching, and I can't hear it. It's kind of a little bit of a cluster frick, but I'm going to go ahead and read those 2 donations that I received today. Hopefully they're nice. Let's be nice to people. It's only coincidence they're all Jews. Is the night our boy finally... I mean, ultimately, bro, if you were paying attention to the substance of we read, it's that the CIA was controlling the Frankfurt School and using them to defend established capitalist rules. So, yeah, I don't know, man. I think it should start becoming more clear, guys. The CIA doesn't like communism. It doesn't mean that communism is good, but it's just an interesting piece of information to understand. This man will never blame anything on the Jews. Well, you know, the information we were getting in the article, it just didn't really point in that direction. Anyway, good discussion. Let's continue. So, here we go. Ex-CIA, speak of the devil, chief predicts Chinese president's next moves after Pelosi's Taiwan trip. Let's hear from our buddies. Not the Jews. Honestly, like Nazis. A lot of German Nazi scientists and... Yeah, the Jews do not control the CIA. Not even close. The Anglo establishment, British intelligence, MI6, mercantile class. You guys will never get it, bro. People in the chat, just a warning to you guys, people in the chat who never let up on the pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi, anti-Jewish sentiment, they very likely could be feds. People who blame everything on the Jews and who just never shut up about Jews and how much they love Hitler. It's oftentimes feds trying to make your movement look bad, trying to make you look like Nazis. So just for the record, the opinions of people in chat do not reflect my opinions.
You say there will be repercussions for Pelosi's visit. We're already seeing a blockade of sorts around Taiwan. What do you think we'll see?
Well, I don't think that President Xi, at the end of the day, really wants to provoke conflict here. His words seem to indicate that he's not out to pick a fight in response to this action that has taken place, which has been awkward to say the least, particularly in Washington, where you have the president, the national security, military reportedly discouraging this, the speaker going ahead, others saying it's the speaker's right, and it is. But again, the timing of this is very difficult in particular because President Xi, let's remember, he is in election season as well. Mm-hmm. He's 3 months away from the gathering of the Chinese Communist Party, which will presumably re-elect him for an unprecedented third term as party leader. That will be followed by his re-election as the president and the head of the military commission. He wanted a smooth path to this particular trip at this time.
Ultimately, our CIA's goal is they serve as the foot troops of the mercantile class. So making sure that people like Rockefeller and JP Morgan, making sure they keep their billions and billions of dollars. That's ultimately what the CIA's mission is protecting the wealth of the mercantile class who rules the world. So Republicans who shill for capitalism, you're basically like working for the elite for free. It would be kind of nice to take these people who had billions and billions of dollars and ruled the world with an iron fist and maybe take their money away and put them in the gulags. Who said that? It wasn't me. All right, moving on.
And in this way really does force him to be an ultra-nationalist. He has to show that he's tougher than all the rest. So you will see these live fire exercises all around the island of Taiwan. You'll see aircraft back into the airspace and so forth. All of this, I think, we will see. And I would suspect this may play out over some time as well. This will not just be, a spasm of activity right now. There could be further repercussions down the line. There are also some economic sanctions that have been imposed on Taiwan as a result of this as well. So this will take some time to play out. I don't see conflict right now. I don't think that's in his or China's interests, but we clearly have positioned our forces and our capabilities so that we can do what is necessary if it comes to that.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her delegation were seen leaving Taiwan's capital. Pelosi gave a powerful speech. She made it clear that the U.S. stands in support of the self-governing island. China is calling Pelosi's visit to Taiwan a, quote, complete farce, and responded with plans for military exercises around the island. CNN's Will Ripley is live in the Taiwanese capital. Also joining us is CNN national security analyst Beth Sanner. Will, what is the latest from there on what has been such an anticipated visit all around?
Well, there's two different storylines that we've been following. One, of course, is Nancy Pelosi making this historic trip, giving a speech about democracy and friendship and solidarity with Taiwan, and meeting with, from political leaders to business leaders like TSMC, the chip manufacturer, visiting sites, that are significant historically here. But then, literally just miles off of the coast of Taiwan, you have the Chinese military assembling at 6 different locations around the island. And these exercises, Taiwanese officials have basically called it tantamount to almost a blockade or a practice for a blockade to try to stop supplies from.
By the way, if it seems like I've spoken too many things that seem eerily in favor of communism, it's important to note that books like Wall Street and the Rise of the Bolshevik Revolution points out that the Anglo establishment, the money mercantile powers, they like to fund communist revolutions. It's a great way to destroy countries and make an extra buck off of war. So communism is definitely not something to be, it's not the solution, but it's not necessarily the top dog enemy either, is the point.
Coming into Taiwan, if there was some sort of a military conflict, a blockade is the first thing that you would see as a warning sign here. So China essentially simulating that. And now, as a result, Taiwan is renegotiating air travel routes, trying to find ways to get planes through the Philippines or Japan instead of trying to fly over the Chinese military. Nancy Pelosi's plane actually had to take a 3-hour detour arriving here to avoid the South China Sea and to avoid heavily militarized areas that she might have to fly over. So this is very serious business. Even vessels are being rerouted as a result of this. And I think the crucial thing.
Can't take away Rockefeller's money. Can't do it. No trolls have spoken. Oh my gosh, Rockefeller losing their money and power and influence. I'm getting a headache. Like, can't do it. Can't do it. Can't take away Bill Gates' money. You just can't do it. It's not a solution, guys.
Thing to watch now, Brianna, is what happens now that Nancy Pelosi's plane has left. What does China do now? Because this is the time that these exercises are really due to kick off in large scale.
And Beth, that's where I want to take this for your analysis. Look, we've had past speakers of the House visit Taiwan. Recently in April, we had a bipartisan Senate delegation visit Taiwan. But clearly the reaction to Nancy Pelosi's visit is different. She's been a longtime critic of the regime.
Anybody want to remind me what fallacy that is? That's what Black Lives Matter does. That's some sort of a fallacy. I want to say like correlation fallacy or guilt by association or genetic fallacy. I'm a little rusty on what fallacy that is, but yeah, that's what Black Lives Matter does. That's not a logical argument. In a second here, I'll remember what fallacy that is.
In Beijing, but what is your take on this announcement of military exercises and this encircling of the island that Will just described?
I think we have to take this and put this into a broader context. On one hand, this is definitely about Speaker Pelosi's visit and the fact that she's such a high-ranking official. She's part of Biden's party.
No, you actually made a logical fallacy. You're going to want to go look up what a logical fallacy means. It means that you objectively lost the debate as according to the rules of Aristotelian logic. So I'm going to try to remember which logical fallacy it is. I mean, a genetic fallacy is when you say it's more or less a genetic fallacy. Like if you said that solution comes from Black Lives Matter, that's your argument, it's bad because it comes from Black Lives Matter, then that would be a genetic fallacy. So you say that's the Black Lives Matter strategy. It's more or less a genetic fallacy. It's not an argument.
Party, she and others can't separate what she's doing from us just poking a finger in their eye. But the bigger context.
Last I checked, Black Lives Matter was funded by people like George Soros and I'm sure various other big money sources. Like Black Lives Matter is funded by these people that I'm saying should have their money taken away. So ultimately, it's just you're not really coming from a place of reason.
Text here is that this is about U.S.-China relations being at the bottom of the barrel. It is a
Well, actually, a logical fallacy equals that I'm a couple of semesters away from a bachelor's in philosophy, and I studied philosophy at university, and a lot of what you learn about in philosophy is logical fallacies. I took logic, symbolic, and reasoning and a Logic 102 course and aced both of them. So actually what a logical fallacy amounts to is that you made a genetic fallacy, which means that according to the objective rules of Aristotelian logic, I'm smarter than you. Like, it's not my opinion. I've actually proven it with logic and reason. You're welcome. Maybe you learned something today.
About China-Taiwan relations, and those are going nowhere. The idea of a peaceful resolution to unification looks far and farther than it's ever been. And the fact that China itself isn't doing very well in the year that Xi was supposed to have his best year ever. So there's a bigger context here, and it's not just about Pelosi's visit.
Do you think, Beth, this is going to change how U.S. officials are approaching visits, are approaching outreach going forward when they look at this pretty overwhelming response, pretty dramatic response that we're seeing from China?
I think that we will have to calibrate. I mean, I think about U.S. visits and U.S. meetings. These are instruments of power. And so, what I would say is that we have to be very calibrated in how we use these things.
It's elementary. Antifa's establishment, Black Lives Matter's establishment, Proud Boys are establishment. That's why they went and conveniently invaded the Capitol building. It was led by feds. Just get with the program, bro. Feds run Proud Boys. Feds run Antifa. Feds run Black Lives Matter. Everybody knows this, dude. Where have you been?
And understand the consequences. Not that we should avoid what we want to do, but that we have to understand and do it purposefully.
It's a very, very interesting point there, and we'll have to see if that's how they proceed going forward. Because every visit, certainly China is approaching this as sort of a poke in the eye, as you said. Beth, thank you so much. Our thanks to Will as well.
Thank you for trying to debate me and objectively losing, as according to the rules of Aristotelian logic. Let the record show that you made a genetic fallacy. What you're saying is what Black Lives Matter does, therefore it's bad. That is a fallacy. That is fallacious. You lost. Thank you for losing. Okay. I wasn't really paying attention to that. Maybe you guys were. Meeting with TSMC might be the most important for Miss Wall Street's best trader. This is what the U.S. tells China. The U.S. side declared the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. Let's just move on to the next video.
What is the risk here that we'll see a more forceful response from Beijing? Of course, they've already announced military tests, missile tests and the like, given that President Xi is perhaps not...
I mean, at its very root, saying that that's what Black Lives Matter does, therefore it's bad. Yeah, you could say it's like an association fallacy. I mean, it doesn't really matter what you call it, honestly. That maybe sounds like cope, but if you're schooled in fallacies, you just know that's what Black Lives Matter does. I wouldn't say that. It's just a fallacy. It's just fallacious. That's not how it works. It's in the ballpark of a genetic fallacy. If they were to say that idea was created by Black Lives Matter, then it would be a genetic fallacy. You're pointing at the source of where it comes from and trying to say because of where it comes from, it's wrong by the fact that it's where it comes from. It's very close to a genetic fallacy.
Not coming from the strongest position in what is a critical year for him.
Yeah, that's true. I would say, though, in comparison to previous crises that the United States has experienced with China, more specifically the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crisis, China is in a much stronger position now, which is why there is a heightened level of concern here in the United States and amongst the Department of Defense. But I take your point that for Xi Jinping, this is a really critical window between now and the 20th Party Congress, October, November, sometime this year. He really can't afford to be seen weak when ostensibly provoked by the United States. And again, that's why there's significant.
My view, for those who don't remember, is that the CIA are the ground troops of the mercantile order that ultimately rules the world. And mercantile class basically just being the richest people, the richest bloodlines, and you can find their interests represented by CIA, NSA, military intelligence, as well as fraternal orders, including Catholic Knights, Jesuits, and the classic Freemasons. Pretty standard stuff.
Concerned about where this could go.
Where is the end game here, particularly as we consider we continue to watch this relationship as probably the great strategic competitive relationship of our time, right? Where does this go from here?
Well, first of all, I hope we get till next Monday without this really spiraling into a crisis. And I should just say, I think that's probably the most likely outcome of this is we're going to see another 3 or 4 days of significant tensions as the People's Liberation Army does a series of live fire drills, exercises. The United States will move some military hardware into the region. So this is going to feel tense. I think what this really signals, though, is that the bilateral relationship has unfortunately moved into a much more contentious period where it's beyond trade now, it's beyond technology and Huawei. We're now actually seeing this move into the domain of actual military strategy. And what that means is we're going to have to really be watching out for where slight missteps in calculation.
You could say that the first and foremost goal of this movement is to make you understand why Christianity is the truth, why the Bible is the word of God, and what happens to society. Reform Stoic, how come I went through the public school system and watched Comedy Central growing up and watched Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network and watched every Hollywood movie that came out. I went and got a bachelor's degree from your average university. Everything has taught me about scientific atheism, Big Bang Theory, gravity, heliocentric universe. There's no empirical evidence of a God from what we know. It looks like materialist scientific atheism is the way. However, there's some very interesting studies on quantum mechanics and quantum physics. Like, wow, have you seen What the Bleep Do We Know? It looks like particles are popping in and out of existence, and we might live inside of a simulation. How come I believe that? How come watching television and movies and going to a public school and going to a university, why did they teach me this worldview and not yours? Because the system is corrupt. And I think a very good working blueprint for this kind of domination is Plato's Republic. The philosopher kings have the allegory of the cave at play. Well, we are living inside of their cave, and those who leave the cave are seen as conspiracy theorists. Doesn't mean all conspiracy theorists know everything there is to know. A lot of them believe in weird bullshit, but I and my friends in this movement have left the cave, and we have gained knowledge of the noble lie that is ushered by the philosopher kings in their new world, the new Atlantis.
Can lead to exacerbating crises.
Yeah, even if you take a look at how the military drills are planned, some are saying this actually resembles a naval blockade. That should we be worried about a Normandy-style sort of invasion of Taiwan at this point? I mean, given what's happened with Ukraine, I think tensions are very high. Are these concerns warranted at this point?
No, for the sake of this short discussion, I will say this is not a Normandy-style invasion we should be worried about. And I should say that what the PLA is doing with the formation of the proposed exercises that they're doing is to make it look like this is what we would do in a blockade. This is a threat. This is an attempt to be a deterrent message to the United States and to Taiwan to say there is a price for your salami slicing, or there is a price for these high-level engagements between the U.S. and Taiwan. I would say personally, though, I wouldn't be worrying as an investor, as an MNC, about this sort of bolt from the blue invasion. I would be worrying about an
really quick, missiles are not fake. Nuclear weapons, I mean, that's the theory. The theory is not that missiles are fake, it's that nuclear weapons are fake. Just to clear that up.
experience or an event we have where the PLA rubs up against a Japanese air fighter or a U.S. air fighter, and we're really primed with the level of distrust in the relationship for that to spiral. I would completely put away in fantasy land the idea that Xi Jinping is going to wake up and say, now's a good day to invade an island 90 miles off my shore.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about the reaction from neighbors. I mean, this cannot sit well with the likes of, as you mentioned, perhaps Japan and also South Korea, where Speaker Pelosi is headed next.
Yeah, so right now you're seeing no real distance between U.S. allies and partners in the region. They're not going to want to create any daylight between them and the U.S. Privately, though, of course, they're watching this with great unease. I think there was some doubt about whether or not Pelosi should have made the trip. I don't think anyone doubted that she at some point could make a trip, but why now? It's August. Beidaihe is starting the meeting between senior party officials. 20th Party Congress is coming. This was almost designed to really antagonize Beijing. So I think a lot of partners and allies in the region are going to have this dual-headed approach of both, on the one hand, somewhat sympathetic, as the U.S. tries to bolster the defense of Taiwan and show some support, but on the other hand, apprehensive, because for us, this is a faraway crisis. If you're Japan, Australia, Philippines, Singapore, this is right in your backyard. And so they're going to, of course, be watching this warily.
It's a domestically key, well, it's always a domestically key year for the leadership in China, but this year in particular, talk to me about the insight you have into potentially the huge pressure points that there is happening within China, right? The property market, the regulatory crackdown, whether or not we see a continuation of COVID-0 in its current formation. What would be some of those conversations and potentially, faction forming at, as you say, these meetings at Beidaihe that might be happening at the moment?
Yeah, let me, just before I give my analysis, take two things off the table. One is a full-on collapse, and the other is the fact that Xi Jinping is going to be purged from office. Neither of those are going to happen. But this is definitely not the year Xi Jinping wanted to have, as your question indicated, starting with the war in Ukraine through this just a significant economic softening that we're seeing, in large part the result of policy decisions that Beijing has made. This is not so much structural forces that are now depressing economic performance. This is some really boneheaded decisions Beijing has made around COVID-0 and its interventions, and then lack thereof in the property market. What is this going to lead to in terms of the 20th Party Congress and beyond? I would say, again, Xi Jinping will remain in power, but right now this is definitely shaping the choices of personnel. There's probably at the margin a stronger bargaining hand for those who are looking to move their people up into the Politburo and the Central Committee, as opposed to Xi Jinping being able to run the deck. I would imagine this is shaping the conversation about who's going to be premier in a different way than it was probably going to be the case 6 months ago, or if the economic performance was doing better. But final comment here on this, Xi Jinping is 70 years old. He's pretty set in his ways. I would not expect a dramatically different policy approach to the domestic economy or foreign affairs after the 20th Party Congress.
And Jude, just quickly, what do you make of Washington's messaging here, especially coming from the Biden administration?
It's a mess, and it's a mess in an area of extraordinary significance where the precise word we use really matters. And I have to say, the best reassurance we could make to Beijing is simply to have a consistent, clear message across the U.S. government without these wide deltas and swings and discrepancies. It's really contributing to an already volatile situation.
Okay, so going back to your question, you said, do you think it's corrupt or are they dumb? Well, at the highest levels, it's corrupt, but modern education is largely a pyramid scheme where the professors are merely regurgitating what they've been taught. So I guess to answer your question, the majority of academia is just dumb. I'm not trying to be mean. They've absorbed a lot of information. They've learned a lot of vocabulary and ideas and concepts. They've gone through school. They've received a lot of information. But when it comes to seeing through the veil, critical thinking is involved, and you can absolutely go get a PhD and absorb all of the opinions of academia and just become a cog in their machine where you've never really questioned any of what you were taught. So at the highest levels, people know what they're doing, but the majority of this machine is run by more or less useful idiots who believed what they were taught. So, we are going to watch a 16-minute video on liberal versus conservative theology. That should be interesting. I'm really just going to kind of brush over this. I don't even think this is a very large article to begin with. Hot off the press today, CNBC. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's Taiwan trip has once again shown a spotlight on the island's critical role in the global chip supply chain, and in particular on TSMC. TSMC manufactures semiconductors for technology giants such as Apple and NVIDIA. Pelosi met with TSMC chairman Mark Liu in a sign of how critically important semiconductors are to U.S. national security and the integral role that company plays in making the most advanced chips. I hated the propaganda of math class. Well, that's the beauty of something like math, is that math is objective for the most part. Interestingly, when you start looking at calculus, it does start to become theoretical at the highest levels, but the base foundational, a lot of people would say like up to 9th grade level math, is just something that reflects objective ideas. But yeah, we're not talking math here. Math is pretty objective for the most part. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi may have left Taiwan, but the visit has cast a spotlight once again on the island's critical role in the global chip supply chain, and in particular on the world's biggest chip maker. The controversial visit, which angered Beijing, saw Pelosi meet with TSMC chairman Mark Liu in a sign of how critically important semiconductors are to U.S. national security and the integral role that the company plays in making the most advanced chips. Semiconductors, chips, yeah, we get it. Taiwan's unresolved diplomatic status will remain a source of intense geopolitical uncertainty. Even Pelosi's trip underlines how important Taiwan is for both countries. Head of Asia research at Verisk Mabelcraft told CNBC's Street Signs Europe on Wednesday. All right, I think we're good on that. So let me make a point here. So I hated the propaganda of math class in school. So you're trying to imply if math class didn't lie to me, then that logically deduces that it's impossible for any teacher to lie to me. If I was never lied to in math class, that would deduce that I was never lied to in any other class in school, is basically the argument that it appears that you're lining out there. Well, what I would have to say to that is that when I attended UNLV, I was taught in my biology class that there are two genders, and then I was taught in my philosophy of law class that gender is a spectrum. So that is direct evidence that I have experienced two opposing worldviews in the very same school, which further implies that there are differing worldviews within the school. So ultimately, your posited argument that because I wasn't lied to in math deduces that it's impossible to ever be lied to in school is ultimately refuted. It was a valiant effort, but ultimately, nobody really stands a chance against Smear Gang. Okay, guys, theological liberal versus theological conservative. We had a long show today, and I'm digging it. Let's learn it.
What does it mean to be theologically liberal or theologically conservative? Let me begin by clarifying that in this video, we'll be discussing this as it relates to Christianity, and also that we'll discuss it from the viewpoint of various American Christian denominations. For example, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ would be known to be a denomination that is theologically liberal, whereas the Southern Baptist Convention is theologically conservative. What does that mean? First, theological liberalism denies the inerrancy of the Bible, while theological conservatism affirms it. Inerrancy means that a person views the Bible as having no errors or contradictions. The Bible can contain poetic parts, it can contain historical parts, it can correctly quote someone who is lying, it can have passages that different people interpret differently. But in the final analysis, there cannot be any part of the Bible that we identify as being incorrect. This also means that if the Bible presents something as historical, we aren't allowed to decide that it's mythologized or simply allegorical. Unless there is compelling internal understanding of the text that shows that we're reading something non-literal or poetic, we should accept the plain sense of the text. Theological liberalism, however, does not accept inerrancy. There can be a broader set of views in this camp. Some would claim that the Bible doesn't have errors, but that they don't want to use the term inerrancy because of what proponents of inerrancy believe. They would say that people who believe in inerrancy take the Bible too literally. So the Bible is not in error, but it contains sections of myth that literalists claim to be history, or it presents the creation story as an allegory, but theological conservatives force us to treat it as a literal account. A second view is that the Bible is itself not the Word of God, but that it is the Word of men, and contains some of the words of God. So the men messed up some of the time, they were contradictory, but if you sift through, you will find the truth. Other views are that the Bible becomes the Word of God as it speaks to the heart of the reader, or that the Bible is free from error on matters of doctrine, but not in areas of history. This isn't a video on inerrancy, so I won't go further on that right now, but you can see how the inerrancy is a starting point for what we'll go on to discuss. Take, for example, the Bible's teaching on divorce and remarriage. Romans 7 in the New Testament says, "The woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth, but if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband liveth she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man." A Christian denomination that teaches that the Bible is inerrant will be obligated to accept this statement, and their teaching on what makes an acceptable divorce or remarriage will have to handle the passage as meaning exactly what it seems to mean. Often, theological conservative denominations will release position papers on divorce and remarriage, comparing all the biblical passages and then making statements on what is allowed and what is not. What a theological conservative denomination cannot do is say that the relevant passage was just Paul's opinion, or that it simply reflected the social views of the time, or that the passage is not spoken by Jesus and therefore not binding. Some have said that inerrancy is a new position, and it is true that historically the term inspired was used rather than inerrant. However, it was also generally accepted that the Bible being inspired meant that it was free from error. If God inspired the Bible, and God cannot make a mistake, then the Bible too can have no mistakes. Since the Confessions didn't say inerrant, though, theological liberalism allowed people to claim adherence to inspiration, but deny inerrancy, and this was not what the vast majority of Christianity had believed prior to theological liberalism's heyday. Theological liberalism began to grow in American Christianity, especially in the late 1800s, and by the middle of the 1900s, many of the largest Christian denominations in America had majorities of theologically liberal ministers and congregations. This completely changed the way that the denominations argued with each other. Let me explain. Take some of the common denominational categories you hear today, and let's look at them 2 centuries ago. Episcopal, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, Congregationalists. What's the difference there? Well, Congregationalists and Presbyterians were Reformed. They taught unconditional election and limited atonement, for example. Baptists were divided. Particular Baptists taught unconditional election, and General Baptists didn't. Methodists were mostly Arminian, opposed to the Reformed positions on the matter. Lutherans rejected most of the Reformed framework, but also held views different from Arminianism. Baptists and Congregationalists had only congregational church polity, no synods or presbyteries, no bishops. Episcopalians had episcopal polity, as did many Lutherans and Methodists. Presbyterians had Presbyterian church polity. Each denomination would defend their polity as the best, or perhaps even the only acceptable, option. Additionally, many of these denominations had confessions. These are documents that present the denomination's position on a wide area of theological topics, and especially attempt to clarify and nail down their beliefs on areas that other Christians disagree on. Congregationalists had the Savoy Declaration. Presbyterians had the Westminster Confession. Lutherans had the Augsburg Confession. Episcopalians had the 39 Articles of Religion. Particular Baptists had the London Baptist Confession of Faith. In the late 1800s, these denominations began to also fight over their views of end times. As premillennialism had a resurgence in America, some who had become known as fundamentalists would argue that it was the only literal and acceptable biblical position. Others, like most Presbyterians, would argue strongly against the premillennial, especially the dispensational premillennial position, as being incompatible with their faith. And how are these arguments conducted? Whether in books, in person, or from the pulpit, each denomination would appeal to biblical evidence and possibly also the tradition of Christianity as expressed in the historic confessions or practice of the churches. There are plenty of books and videos that discuss what caused the rise of theological liberalism. German rationalism and higher criticism played a part, acceptance of evolution and a supposed incompatibility of inerrancy with contemporary science, and so forth. However, the result was that by the mid-1900s, inerrancy wasn't the prevailing view in theologically liberal churches, and most of the mainline churches in America had become theologically liberal. What this led to was a broadening orthodoxy in those denominations. What I mean is that in the past, in a Presbyterian church, it was orthodox to believe in limited atonement. Christ's death atoned for the sin of the elect. That was the narrow slice of belief on atonement that was orthodox. Views like general atonement, Christ's death atoned for the sin of all people, but only those who believe are saved, or universalism, ultimately all people will be saved, were not acceptable. But the arguments for limited atonement were based on a literal reading of the scripture, and for a theologically liberal denomination, if they were going to allow differing views on the literalness of the Genesis creation account, for example, why not on atonement too? You can see where this is going, because the next question is, why not on the polity of the church too? And why not on views of end times? And why not on the views of the presence of Christ in the elements of communion? And why not on baptism and on unnecessary salvation experience? And so on. As theologically liberal denominations broadened in orthodoxy, eventually the acceptable range of beliefs began to heavily overlap with others. This was seen throughout the second half of the 20th century, especially within these denominational categories, as denominations began to merge together. For Lutherans, the United Lutheran Church in America, American Lutheran Church, and Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches merged together into the ELCA in 1988. For Methodists, the Evangelical United Brethren Church and Methodist Church USA merged into the United Methodist Church in 1968. In 1983, the Presbyterian Church in the U.S. and Presbyterian Church in the United States of America merged together into the Presbyterian Church USA. Other reasons for these and other mergers can be given, such as previous divisions over slavery being mended in some cases, but any theological arguments that could have prevented merger were smoothed over by the broad orthodoxy of theological liberalism. Then, as the theologically liberal denominations in each denominational category consolidated, there was one step further. Why not cross denominational boundaries too? After all, Presbyterians and Congregationalists aren't all that different in their theologically liberal form. In 1957, the Congregational denomination in the United States, Congregational Christian Churches, merged with the Evangelical and Reformed Church, a Presbyterian denomination, to form the United Church of Christ. Instead of dissolving their separate church structures and all merging together, the theologically liberal denominations all began to sign full communion agreements. Ministers can move freely between denominations. All members can share in the Lord's Supper in each other's church, and so forth. In 1989, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, entered full communion with the United Church of Christ. In 1997, 4 denominations entered into mutual full communion: the United Church of Christ, ELCA, PCUSA, and Reformed Church in America. In 1999, the Episcopal Church entered full communion with the ELCA, and the Moravian Church entered full communion with the ELCA also. In 2009, the ELCA entered full communion with the United Methodist Church. In 2010, the Moravian Church entered full communion with the Episcopal Church. In 2015, the United Church of Christ entered full communion with the United Church of Canada. In 2016, the Moravian Church entered full communion with the PCUSA. In 2018, the United Methodist Church entered full communion with the Moravian Church. In 2019, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ entered full communion with the United Church of Canada. The Episcopal Church and United Methodist Church are currently working on a full communion agreement. Likely, the UMC will be divided into 2 denominations soon, and the more progressive denomination will doubtless secure the full communion agreement. Theologically conservative denominations can have full communion too, but it means that the two denominations see eye to eye within their much narrower orthodoxy. For example, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is in full altar and pulpit fellowship with the AALC, but barring some massive shift, there's no circumstance in which the LCMS would ever have the same fellowship with a non-Lutheran denomination. So let's go back to the topic of denominational labels: Lutheran, Presbyterian, Congregationalist. On the theologically liberal side, these titles mean very little. Your Presbyterian Church USA church may have an Evangelical Lutheran Church in America minister. On the whole, a theologically liberal church of any denomination will be more similar to other theologically liberal churches than it will be to a church with the same denominational tag that is theologically conservative. If a member of a theologically liberal PCUSA Presbyterian church moves to a city without a PCUSA church, they will feel very out of place in a theologically conservative PCA Presbyterian church, but more at home in a Disciples of Christ church. Because of the narrow orthodoxy in theologically conservative denominations, churches that become more liberal tend to leave. But in theologically liberal denominations, for decades, more conservative churches often remain and gradually become a smaller and smaller minority. So within the Episcopal Church and Presbyterian Church USA, the United Church of Christ, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, there are some churches that are theologically conservative, and certainly there are church members who are. However, as theologically conservative churches continue to teach certain doctrinal positions as unacceptable or certain behaviors as sinful, for many congregations there comes a point where they no longer feel comfortable in a denomination which accepts or advances beliefs they find to be in violation of their conscience. For example, when the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America entered into full communion with the Episcopal Church in 1999 under an agreement titled Called to Common Mission, the ELCA agreed to certain changes to their episcopal polity that led to their episcopate being accepted as part of Anglican apostolic succession. This was necessary for the Episcopal Church to link up with them. Many more conservative churches in the ELCA didn't accept this accommodation of apostolic succession, and so they split off into a new denomination, Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ. Conversely, congregations sometimes leave in groups from more conservative denominations that they hoped to push more moderate or liberal, but found their efforts rebuffed, such as the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which withdrew from the Southern Baptist Convention, with one of the main reasons being their opposition to the SBC's prohibition of women in ordained ministry. A particularly major recent reason for theologically conservative churches to exit their denominations was the acceptance of homosexuality and gay marriage in many of the theologically liberal denominations in the past few decades. So what will be the main differences between theologically liberal and theologically conservative churches? On some areas, certain teachings fall exclusively into one side or the other, and on other matters there are moderate or in-between positions. For example, no theologically liberal denominations will prohibit women in ministry, but there are theologically conservative denominations that allow them, such as Assemblies of God. Theologically conservative denominations do not condone homosexuality, but neither do all theologically liberal denominations, at least not yet. What seems to be the case generally is that the theologically liberal denominations begin to affirm homosexuality and transgenderism as their membership's opinion on those matters shift. Certain theological distinctives will be enforced in theologically conservative churches and not in theologically liberal churches. Many theologically conservative holiness churches will expel a minister who denies a second definite sanctification experience, but a theologically liberal church wouldn't. Theologically conservative evangelical churches would expel a ministry who denied the necessity of a born-again experience. Theologically conservative Pentecostal churches wouldn't put up with someone who believed spiritual gifts had ceased, and some theologically conservative Mennonites wouldn't keep a minister who baptized with a mode other than pouring. Nowadays, for a ministry to be disciplined in a theologically liberal denomination over doctrine generally requires not that the minister do something too heretical, but rather that they refuse to do something that they consider heretical. For example, Bishop William Love in the Episcopal Church wouldn't allow his diocese to perform same-sex marriages, and the denomination took him to trial, and eventually he was forced to resign. In the 21st century in America, a lot of the hot-button political issues line up so that on many issues, theological conservatives hold the politically conservative position, and the theological liberals hold the politically progressive position. But this is not always the case. particularly because neither side always necessarily wants to use the law to enforce their theological position. An example where theological conservatism generally aligns with political conservatism is abortion. There are also cases where theological liberals hold a politically liberal or progressive position, but some theological conservatives hold it too. This would be the case in some hotly contested issues today, like critical race theory or critiques of capitalism. On other issues, one's political position may not be able to identify their theological position at all. For example, on the issue of foreign involvement in war, there are denominations that teach or allow pacifist or resistant theology that would be on opposite ends of the theological liberal conservative spectrum. The same is the case with capital punishment. There are also many issues where theological conservatives continue to teach something as sinful, but it doesn't necessarily lead to any political action. Today, most who are opposed to drinking alcohol don't push for prohibition, although there are still some who do, and there are many theological conservatives who are politically libertarian, and so while they would not use recreational drugs, they are also in favor of legalizing or decriminalizing the use of them. And there are a whole bunch of areas where theological conservatives disagree. Things like the presence of Christ in the elements of communion, the mode and subjects of baptism, and the place of miraculous spiritual gifts. The question of theological liberalism versus conservatism covers in its scope all of Christianity. So for a broad topic, I've painted with a broad brush. For every example I've given, there are certainly people or groups that are different. And some of you are already prepared to comment that something I have called theologically liberal isn't liberal at all. But that's the nature of the debate. And the lines between being a moderate liberal or a liberal moderate or a moderate moderate or a conservative moderate or a pushing the boundaries conservative aren't always so clear. Within each denomination, those fighting the fight will draw the lines in different places, and that's why it's such a difficult topic to pin down. So for more clarity, you'll have to dig into the beliefs of denominations on both sides. For example, within Lutheranism, watch the video on the ELCA for a liberal example, or on the LCMS for a conservative one. If you want more videos like this one, please like this video so I know it's something you've enjoyed.
Oh my goodness gracious, that was a mouthful. Okay, well, hopefully you absorbed some of that. So what denomination is the right one? This is something that, atheists think is very funny. Well, you have to understand Catholics and Orthodox, they also play off of this sentiment. Like Protestants have 30,000 denominations. So I would maintain that salvation is by faith in Jesus Christ. We are all flawed as human beings. We are all ingrained with this inherited sin, and we all fail to meet the expectations and standards set by the Bible and the Word of God. So the key to salvation is understanding that Jesus Christ lived, that the Gospels are truth, that the apostles lived, that Christ lived, Christ performed miracles, died on the cross, rose again, and is in fact the Christ, is in fact the Son of God, part of the Trinity. You accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and I believe that you will be saved, regardless of which church that you go to. Now, keep in mind, Mormons are pretty far off the beaten path to where I'm not so sure if Mormons are getting saved. I'm to a point where I could see myself, maybe not here, because this is my hometown, it's very small and things are complex here for me. I could see myself going to Catholic Mass. And I don't think that you have to get saved. But yeah, it's complicated. I wouldn't worry about it. I would look for a good church in your hometown. I definitely embrace conservative theology, overwhelmingly so. So I would recommend that you find a theologically conservative church and that you go there and, base it on, are the people nice? Are you comfortable there? Are the pastors or priests avoiding political topics? Are they shilling political views to you? Those are the kind of things I'd be looking out for. You might find yourself saying, wow, there's a very nice Presbyterian church here where everybody's great and there's a strong community. Just look for look for good people, passing people. I would maintain that Black Lives Matter burns down Wendy's and yells about how all white people should die, though they don't really have the kind of means to ever make that happen. So I'm not going to go like super deep down this train of thought, but I just wanted to make it clear because I know there's people who are like, oh, okay, well, I'm not really studied in fallacies, and this just kind of seems like a cope. Aside from the fact that, saying that's what Black Lives Matter does isn't an argument, I will just go ahead and move past that and say that that's really not what Black Lives Matter does. I'd be interested, maybe we could do a podcast on Black Lives Matter and just really take a good look at what they're about. Are they calling out Rockefeller? Are they calling out JP Morgan? I think you'd be surprised to see, like, if we looked up right now, Rockefeller, Black Lives Matter. Are we still screen sharing? Here, let's go here for a second. Just to kind of give you an idea here. BLM, Rockefeller. Mayors largely support Black Lives Matter. What do we got here? RockefellerFoundation.org. Yeah, so here's RockefellerFoundation.org writing this article. Mayors largely support Black Lives Matter protests, recognize racial disparities in treatment by police, but are not embracing dramatic change to policing. According to instances of police violence, roughly 4 in 10 of America's mayors do not believe police violence is an issue in their cities. I feel like I saw something originally that I wanted to read. The words Black Lives Matter are both a statement of fact and a demand, one that not only unites mayors across the country, but also millions of Americans coast to coast who protested following the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor last year, said Otis Raleigh III, Senior Vice President of the Rockefeller Foundation's U.S. Equity and Economic Opportunity Initiative. So here we have people affiliated with the Rockefeller Foundation in high levels, supporting Black Lives Matter, taking the side of Black Lives Matter. So, no, I don't do what Black Lives Matter does. The organizations that I would like to see stripped of their wealth actually fund and support Black Lives Matter. So that's an important distinction to make. I didn't want people to think like I was running away by pointing out the fallacy. I'm actually realizing as a philosopher and an aspiring logician, sometimes it's much more satisfying and convincing rhetorically to ignore the fallacy and to embrace the fallacious argument and attack it anyway. So there you go. That's a little bit about what I have to say about that. Let me just go ahead and screen share one more time. See, RockefellerFoundation.org, Otis Raleigh III, Senior Vice President of Rockefeller Foundation's U.S. Equity, talking about how the words Black Lives Matter are both a statement and a fact and a demand, one that not only unites mayors across the country, but also millions of Americans. So, yeah. Rockefeller likes Black Lives Matter. And I don't know if Black Lives Matter really has unified, clear-cut, well-thought-out opinions on things. Like I said, my understanding of Black Lives Matter is they like to burn down Wendy's where black people work, and they like to chant things like kill all cops. I don't really see Black Lives Matter as a especially organized thing. I think they're agents of chaos, more or less. But we've had a very healthy podcast today. As far as like the debate, I feel like that's the first time I've kind of had a debate in the middle of the podcast. It could be seen as disruptive for people looking to rewatch the podcast. Love my rewatchers. I love the people who are here, and I love the people who watch it later, baby. Actually, one of my favorite things since I've started doing these podcasts is watching the views go up after the fact. If you missed the live, get cozy. Get your tendies and your chicken nuggies. Maybe put on a cozy show in the background and mute it. Have the glow of the TV. Get all snuggly buggly and watch Watch the Smearcast, baby, the Reformed Stoic podcast. I appreciate you guys. Appreciate you, Zeus Alliance. I think this was one of the best ones. New format, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So tomorrow we will just be hanging out, shooting the shit, getting cozy, nerding out, trying to talk about positive things. And we will be back for the podcast on Friday, same time. God bless you, my friends, and I will see you maybe tomorrow.